it's Lee from colouringqueen.net, and I hope that you are doing well today and having a good day. I'm still colouring in Wild Soul for my Salvo September 2022 colour along, and hopefully I'll get it finished in time before the end of the month. And I have Billy here with me today as well, and she may make a little bit of noise. She has a little bell on her collar, and when she runs around you may hear her Tinkerbell. That's what I call her. I call her Billy Goat or Tinkerbell. So she's always trying to eat things. She is a little Billy Goat. So I've had a good day so far, up early, and took Buddy for a walk before it got too hot. Even though it's spring here, it's still getting quite humid. And then I went and picked up Billy and took her for a walk, and I'm trying to get enough exercise in each day to help with my diabetes, and because I tend to sit a lot at a computer, I need to get up and moving. So I can't find where I've put my Fitbit, so I need to get that into gear and get that going, and so I work out how many steps I do and how many I need to do. So after the walks were over today, then it was time to hit the housework hard. And because it's going to rain, I'm trying to get all my washing done today so that I can get it dried. But we still haven't got a dryer, so it's got to be Mother Nature on the job, and hopefully she gets it done before the rain starts. It's actually getting warm here, and between the rain, it's actually been quite humid. So we took Buddy to the beach on the weekend, and of course he had a great time. He was walking out while the tide was out. He was going all the way to China. If you want to see him, you can look at his Instagram where he puts his pictures on there. I sort of help him a bit, by taking the photo because, his paws can't do that. But yeah, he's on his Instagram and you can see how far he walks out on there if you want to have a look at him. He's cute as a button. And I think he would actually walk for miles if we let him, but the water's actually still too cold for us to swim and go and get him, and I'm not a very good swimmer to start, so if he goes too far out, I have to rely on him coming back by name recall, and sometimes he's like a little toddler and he just kind of ignores us, especially if it's at a time where he's going to have a seizure or something. But anyway, he had a great time at the beach, which got me thinking about the beach. So I thought I would bring you a beach story today. It's about going to the beach and what to do there, and you might learn something, you might not. I certainly did when I looked at this case, and yeah, I was involved with this story, and I can tell you, yeah, I actually learnt something from it. So here we go. Here's today's story. So it was the 7th of November 1997, and Guy Swain and his male flatmate and a female friend, they decided that they would head to the iconic Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia, for a swim. Now, even if you're not from Australia, you probably would have seen photos of Bondi. It is, as I said, iconic. People seem to think we only have one beach in Australia, that's Bondi. We don't. And personally, it's not a favourite beach of mine because it's just too crowded, but, for each their own. I prefer, much quieter beaches, but Bondi is very touristy, it's very busy, and, it's a very nice beach, but not really for everyone. The south side of Bondi is actually a bit rougher than the north side, so if you're travelling there, bear that in mind, especially if you're from another country and you're not really familiar with Australian beaches. They can be pretty rough, and Bondi, of course, sees, a rough component of that as well. So Guy Swain and his mates, they sat up on the grassy area that's before the sand on the beach, and him and his flatmate, they drank some beer. They bought some long necks, which they're about 750 millimetres of beer in a long brown bottle. And they arrived there about 1:45, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And they had a drink, but they weren't drunk. And as I said, Bondi is a popular beach. It's patrolled by lifesavers. There's even a reality TV show based on the lifesavers on this beach. And you'll see a lot of people getting in trouble and getting rescued. And sometimes it's pretty horrific. So, as well as rescuing people, the lifesavers keep control of the beach and they basically assess it for risks, and they have to do this multiple times during the day, especially with the large crowds that get there. And they also are responsible for putting up the flags on the beach and getting the rescues done, etc. So, on this day in November, this beautiful spring day, there were 3 lifesavers on duty, and they'd put the usual flags up on the beach where people swim between. Now, I want you to have a think about what those flags actually mean when you see them on the beach, because I admit that I know this case well, and I thought the flags meant something completely different. And I was wrong. So, before 4:30, the flatmate went into the water between the flags, and he was about 15 to 20 metres from the shore, and he took a step down and he actually kicked a sandbar in the water. So the water was about waist deep just before he hit that sandbar, but after that, after he came across the sandbar, the water went just to the top of his knees, so it was a real drop. And at the time, he recalled that this is a bit dangerous because when it had been waist deep, he had been thinking about diving in, but obviously not when he fell down and then it was at his knees. So he returned to his friends on the beach, and then the woman, she decided that she would go into the beach with Guy Swain. And he was about a metre to the right of her as they were wading in, and she also noticed the sandbank and change in the depth of the water. Now, she didn't really go out as far because she's not very good at swimming. She's not a very confident swimmer. But on this day, Guy, about 4:30, he walked about 15 metres into the ocean, and he said the water was about up to his waist. And it was a calm day, the surf was calm. The swell was only about half a metre, which is nothing because this is a surf beach. The day was overcast, and there were about 2,500 people on the beach at that time, although throughout the day there'd been up to 3,500 people. It wasn't a bad day at all. It was a very, very mild day on Bondi Beach. Now, flags indicating the patrolled area on the beach were there. Now, Bondi, as I said, it's a surf beach, and a wave started coming towards Guy Swain when he was walking out. Now, some people without surfboards, they catch the wave and they use their body to body surf when that happens. And others decide to let the wave just wash over them, or people do all sorts of things. But 24-year-old Guy, he decided that he would dive through the wave. And he was an experienced surfer. He'd done a learn to surf course when he was just 11, and he'd surfed with a board, body surfed, and swam at beaches in the Sydney area, including at Bondi Beach. But on this day, disaster struck. He dived in and he hit a sandbar. He says the next thing he remembers is just rolling around in the surf, unable to move any part of my body. And his friends ultimately brought him to the beach where an ambulance was called. He had serious injuries and he ultimately became a quadriplegic. Now, Mr. Swain sued the council that was in control of the beach on the basis of negligence, and particularly he claimed that there was a breach of duty of care. Specifically, the flags had been placed on the beach that day led him to swim in that place, which turned out to have a sandbar. So have a think about it. When the flags are there, that's where you swim, isn't it? But what is it that you think that the flags are there for? Now, he said he believed, he reasonably assumed that the persons or the organisation, in this case Waverley Council, which had the care, control and management of the beach, would not place those flags in a position where a person could be, as it were, encouraged to do something which might be dangerous. So he claimed that the council failed to take reasonable care in positioning the flags and also warning of the sandbar. Now, the case went to the Supreme Court in New South Wales before a judge and a jury of 4 people. Now, judges decide the issues of the law, but the jury gets to decide the issues of fact. So a judge, whether sitting alone, always gives reasons for his or her decisions. Juries don't give any reasons for their decisions. The jury in this case were directed by the judge to assess the facts and decide on the evidence, what evidence they reject, what inferences and conclusions they come to, and then he applies the principles of law to it. Now, Swain's case was that he didn't need to produce any evidence that the risk to him could have been averted by moving those flags, and he didn't provide any evidence on a practical alternative. There was a lot of evidence presented in this case, so much evidence on sandbars and how flags are placed by lifesavers and the conditions on the beach that day, but none relating to that, if moving those flags could have prevented this tragedy from taking place. Anyway, the jury of 4 found that the council had breached its duty of care to warn of the risk of the sandbar and the negligent placement of flags on the beach. There was some confusion initially over whether he'd actually swam between the flags or not, because due to his position when he was found, he was outside of the flags, and if he was outside of the flags, then it kind of follows that the council wouldn't be responsible for what happened. But ultimately, the jury found that he had actually been swimming between the flags. And they also, as I said, they found that he was negligent without giving any reasons. They also found that he had contributed to his injuries as well. And this fancy thing is called contributory negligence. And they assessed that he was about 25% responsible for that. He was awarded $3.75 billion. Now, I know my friends in the US may find this figure a little bit low, but in Australia we generally use a calculation that provides for compensation of loss, like ongoing medical bills and loss of employment and things like that. Then there's also a bit of a discount because you're getting a lump sum rather than money every week. So council were quite surprised by the decision. So Waverley Council appealed the decision, and you have to have grounds for appeal. And their grounds were that there was no evidence of negligence on their part. They believed that nothing that had been presented in evidence was reasonable enough that a jury could determine their liability. And so the Court of Appeal agreed with them, and they couldn't find any negligence either in placement of the flags that day. And they also noted the dangers of diving into surf were quite obvious. They said there's always the possibility of concealed dangers underwater, like the sandbar, which was obvious, and no warning needs to be given in that case. And anyone going to the beach in Australia should be aware of particular variations of sand level underfoot. They also said it was open for the jury to find that placement of the flags by the council on the beach provided an indication to swimmers that swimming between the flags was reasonably safe. However, they didn't feel that this included diving. And so they set aside the verdict in favour of Guy Swain and instead entered in favour of council. Now, Guy Swain, he was only 24 when this accident happened, and he was left quadriplegic just from this day out at the beach with his friends. And so he believed the decision made by the Court of Appeal was incorrect in its view, that a reasonable jury could have found the council was in breach of its duty as to the placement of flags. Because the way that this case turns is that this case the facts were decided by a jury and they don't give their reasons. So he says basically it's not up to the Court of Appeal to say what a reasonable jury would conclude. So he appealed to the High Court. Now, this is the highest court in Australia. There's nowhere else to go after this decision. So whatever they say is now going to be the law. So at issue was whether the New South Wales Court of Appeal had actually been mistaken or erred in law when they decided that there was no evidence that a reasonable jury could have considered the council in breach of its duty in regard to placement of those flags to indicate a safe swimming area. And the majority of the judges in the High Court believed that the Court of Appeal did err. They felt that the council was not in fact negligent, but the point of the question that they were asked to decide and the appeals court was asked to decide was from a jury's finding, and it wasn't whether they agreed with what the jury had decided, but whether there was any evidence on which the jury could reasonably be satisfied that the council was negligent. And in this case, they felt that there was evidence of that. If it had been a decision from a judge, then judges provide all their reasons for their decision. And those reasons called judgments, they're poured over by everyone in order to find any sort of grounds for appeal in the reasoning, like an error of law. But juries, they don't give reasons for that decision. They decide on the facts. And their role was to decide those questions of fact and what evidence they believed and what evidence they didn't believe, and whether counsel was reasonable in accordance with the law of negligence. And in the majority of the High Court's view, they felt that the jury's verdict was reasonable, and they said that beach flags connote swimming with wave interaction, such as flat diving. So what the High Court judges did was basically consider whether the Court of Appeal could actually set aside that original jury verdict that was in favour of Mr. Swain. And they basically decided that they couldn't. So basically this case, a lot of people think it is about diving into Bondi, but really when it comes down to the High Court, it's about whether appeals courts can actually interfere with a verdict made by a jury and decide that the jury were incorrect on their facts. Some people also thought that this case would expand the law of negligence, which is always a big fear among people, that right back to the times of the snail in the bottle that I've talked about before, that the law of negligence will expand. But the actual judges at the High Court, two of them specifically said that if they'd been asked to decide the facts of the case, that they might have come to a completely different conclusion from the jury that did decide those facts. So that's something to think about, and maybe to comfort people that are worried about the law of negligence expanding. But the case made front page news in Australia. There was a lot of talk about it, that the law of negligence had now gone too far, holding councils or bodies or organisations responsible for things, and particularly that the amount of damages was too high. And there were also concerns about how this case would affect the insurance industry, particularly as to the risks that would be covered and kind of a knock-on effect to premiums. Personally, I don't think the damages were too high. Guy Swain was only 24, so that's a long time, a long working career. that he will now have to either do something different or adjust and see what he can do with his now disability. I'm sure there are still things that he can participate in and get a lot of enjoyment from in his life, but it certainly won't be the same life as before that day. And with medical bills and whatnot, I don't really think the damages are too high, but I would be interested in hearing what you think, as always, and what you think it means to swim between the flags, because in this case they basically said that you can't control, what's under the water, and you should basically have expectations that these things are going to be there, and having the flags there just means it's reasonably safe to swim, but obviously you need to be alert because there are a lot of variables in the water and whatnot. So I would be interested in knowing what you think. Personally, I always thought swimming between the flags meant that you were safe, as well as being in a patrolled area, but I thought it really meant that this was a safe area to swim in. And as I said, I'm not a good swimmer, and although I have swum in Bondi before, I certainly wouldn't now, because I'm older and wiser and know that my bad swimming would put other people at risk, because I don't understand rips and currents. I don't understand how sandbars work, but reading the evidence in this case on sandbars was enough to turn me off ever going back in Bondi again, that's for sure. And I prefer to swim in a pool where I can reach the other side and cling to it if I need to with my noodle or whatever. But I'd be interested to hear from you guys that are far better swimmers, no doubt, than me, and what you think it means when you swim between the flags. As I said, I thought it meant that you were safe and that area was patrolled, but it really depends on what you mean by safe. Like, is it safe to swim, which is what the court basically said, but you still have to be aware of other risks like sandbars, or does it mean that that area is just safe? So if it was me and there was a thought that I could fall in a hole and have a difference between my waist and my knee in that step, I would be terrified of going into that space, because as I said, I'm not a good swimmer, and in the past I've had experiences and I have panicked, and that would cause me to panic without a doubt. I'm sure of it, because I like my feet to be able to touch the ground. And bear in mind, I'm also only 5'2", so I'm a bit of a pixie in the water anyway. So but anyway, I'd be interested in knowing what you think about this case. But really, when it came down to the High Court, their decision wasn't on, the facts or the law. Their decision was on that question of whether the Criminal Court of Appeal could actually interfere with a jury verdict and decide something different from what a jury had decided. And under what circumstances they can do that in. So it's quite interesting to read, and always when the judges aren't all in agreement, so there are only 3 judges in agreement with 2 having a different view in this one, I always love reading what the other 2 think. I think, yeah, they're only one by one. When it's completely unanimous, there's a completely different ballpark, because then you feel a little bit more confident that they are all in agreement, rather than just the difference of one person, as in this decision. But I'd be interested in knowing what you think. And this story also affected other cases like years before, on what sort of warnings you would have to give, and whether now you should put up signs that say basically there could be a sandbar here, there could be something else, there could be jellyfish, all of these things that you should now consider putting up and whatnot. So really, I think the way the world is going, will have signs all over the place. warning us of all the things that could happen, but there'll still be things that we don't think of and that get missed out. Like David always says to me, why do they bother putting, on hair dryers, don't put it in the bathtub or in the water? And I say, because someone has done that. There's been cases on it, and now that's why we have to have these warnings on things. Because I guess too, things are obvious to some people, but they're not necessarily obvious to another. But anyway, I'd love to know what you think. And also, it was a big thing during this case, because Guy Swain and his friends had also partaken in some of that stuff that calls E and makes you really happy and love someone, the night before. But that was like a long time before, and whether that affected his judgment and also the consummation of the alcohol on that day. But it was 750 mils, which is like 3/4 of a litre. It's not really that much. But whether that and the drinking and that thing called E the night before had some sort of influence on the decision making, and his experience with swimming and the possible hazards in swimming in Mother Nature. But ultimately that was the decision. But be always interested to hear what you think. And so I think I can hear rain starting. So I feel like I'm going to have to go and rescue the 3 loads of washing that I put on the washing line. And try and find somewhere else to put them to get them all dry. So I think that's it from me. And until next time, stay safe and happy colouring.